Hi everyone, my name is ashtongleckman and welcome to Season 3, Episode 7 of Behind the Score. In today's episode, we're going to be exploring Dario and Marinelli's Oscar and Golden Globe winning score for Atonement. Now this is the second collaboration between Dario and director Joe Wright, and it's followed by many films including Anna Karenina, Hannah, and of course Darkest Hour, which came out a couple years ago. And their careers have been very linked together, and this is sort of at the forefront of that, and it's a perfect example of brilliant musical storytelling, and it's just so interweaved into every single fiber of this film. So we're going to be diving into the thematic material, the different creative elements that Dario Marinelli uses, a little bit that went into the overall creation of it, and we're going to be exploring multiple cues from the movie, including Briony, the opening cue, Two Figures by a Fountain, Robbie's Note, Farewell, and Denouement, which is sort of like the main tragedy theme of the film, also used during the Dunkirk sequence. If you guys are interested in following along with today's episode, you guys can download the Cubase file, MIDI file, and the stems for free down below. And I've also created a brand new BTS film analysis worksheet that's available through my website. The worksheet helps to identify certain things to be looking out for while analyzing a film score, whether it's the different creative elements used by the composer, whether it's the narrative arc, the thematic material. But thank you guys so much for watching. Here's the suite, and I'll see you afterwards. Atonement is an adaptation of the 2001 novel of the same name written by Ian McEwan. The film was directed by Joe Wright, who is one of Marinelli's major collaborators. Their previous work includes Pride and Prejudice and Anna Karenina. The story explores the life of Briony through 3 periods in history, and how her actions as a child affected the lives of her sister Cecilia and the man she fell in love with, Robbie Turner. The story explores topics of guilt, forgiveness, identity, social class, and much more. The score features a major arc throughout the film's runtime, starting off mysterious and urgent, going into a more delicate romantic style, and finally arriving in a more tragic place once the war begins. Upon the film's release, the score received critical acclaim for its brilliant capturing of the many elements of the narrative, even featuring a typewriter to capture the main character Briony's occupation as a novelist. For Atonement, Marinelli received an Oscar and a Golden Globe for Best Original Score.
Music needs to connect at a deeper level of narrative with the film, and it doesn't necessarily need to illustrate what you're already seeing. It doesn't need to provide an atmosphere that is a bit generic, or it doesn't need to provide some kind of tension, intense scene, or romance in a romantic scene. It can introduce an extra layer of narrative.
So welcome to the Elements of the Score section. We're in a completely new room, as you can see. We have the piano upstairs, and then we get a little bit of sunlight, which is always really, really nice. So, talking about Atonement. So, Atonement was recorded by the English Chamber Orchestra, and the score was actually conducted and orchestrated by the amazing Benjamin Wallfisch, who of course has went on to work on films like It, Blade Runner 2049, and so back in the day, you know, this was 2007, Benjamin Wallfisch was doing a lot of work in London, and at this time, you know, and still, Dario Marinelli works out of London, and so they tended to work together quite a bit. So in this score, there's 2 different soloists. We have Carolina Dale, who plays the cello, and she also worked on Pride and Prejudice, and has worked on other films with Dario as well. And then for the piano, we have Jean-Yves Thibault, I hope I pronounced that right, but he did all of the piano solos, and he wasn't the same pianist who worked on Darkest Hour with Dario a couple years ago, but he does an extraordinary job because some of these piano solos are rather difficult. And the main piano solo in the Q Love Letters was actually written away from picture before the film was shot, and it ended up not being usable in the film, so they used it in the ending credits. But it is just a very Brahms-esque piece of music that I think really highlights Dario's incredible abilities to be able to write traditionally, yet really bringing it into a new context. So the first thing in terms of elements of the score is the sonic narrative association. So the really cool thing about this is he actually takes many elements from the movie and includes them inside of the score. So the first thing is, of course, the typewriter, which is meant to describe Briony and her occupation as a novelist, and of course showing that the whole entire film, as we're seeing it as an audience, is through her perspective, which you really see during those final few minutes during her monologue. So that, you know, is a really, really genius idea of immersing the audience in the world of the film using different links that you get from the movie itself. Another example would be when the choir is singing on the beaches of Dunkirk. And then the last example would be when you see the guy playing the harmonica down in the tunnels, and then he actually brings it into the score. It's similar to a little bit of what they did in the film The Imitation Game, where they brought in the accordion player who was playing in the tunnel. So I think that it's a really great way, again, of just introducing another dimension. The next one is the use of the woodwind section in this score, not only in an accompanimental occupation, but also in a leading one. So we have a cat here, and so, you know, you have many things like the clarinet, you have the flute, you of course have the English horn, and very commonly he's sort of using these not only to warm up what's happening in the strings, but also to create a lot of sonic interest. And so it really brings another dimension to a lot of these string passages, and it sort of brings in this like Mozartian, you know, woodwind concerto type vibe. Marinelli in the score is really great in terms of creating lots of variations of the themes and really keeping things interesting. Alright, so we're back in the basement. The rain got a little bit crazy and loud, but we were joined by the cat, which is always nice. So the next thing would be Marinelli's use of soloists. So when you just listen to some of the solos in this film, whether it's the cello solos, whether it's the piano solos, you can just tell that Marinelli has spent a lot of time in his training studying, you know, Mozart, Beethoven concertos, and really studying these instruments in and out, because these specific solos are taking full advantage of really what's possible. I mean, all of the scales, all of the incredible range of the instruments, and you can tell he obviously knows these players and he understands how they work, and he understands definitely the expansive range of those instruments. And then the final thing would be the score's 3-act structure, which is actually not all too common in terms of film scores. So in the first half of the film, Marinelli really focuses in on the mysterious elements in the story. And he also, of course, focuses in on the obsession and the urgency of the main character, Briony, in terms of bringing in those Baroque influences and all of the counterpoint. And the next section of the movie really highlights Cecilia and Robbie's relationship in terms of not only the tragic aspect of it, but also the hopeful aspect of it, and the connection that they obviously still have together. The music really helps to accent that with those two themes. And that's one of the things that I love about the score, is just the level of detail and the level of emotional depth in terms of the writing. And I think the thematic material, even though it is simple, really helps to accent the primary emotions that this film encompasses. So let's go ahead and start off our analysis with the track Briony. So the first thing that we hear in the track are these typewriter sounds. And they're pretty random at first, but then as the track goes along, we get a bit more rhythmic with it. So we have these half notes, 16ths come in, and then as we begin to see, it starts to double, and then it triples, and then of course quadruples. So that constantly keeps things sort of moving. That sort of acts as the motor of the track. So we have this piano come in, which is playing on quarter notes. And then we have this triplet piano ostinato. And the interesting thing about this melody and the sort of mystery aspect of this score is, in general, is that it sort of combines aspects of both major and minor. So this specific phrase, we have a major and then a minor third. So it's constantly drifting between those two things, and it sort of yanks your ear around and sort of gives you a mysterious vibe. We go to the 7th. And then in addition, we have these pizzicatos which come in on the 2s. So in context. And then the pizzicatos sort of halt and wait for this longer phrase to complete. And then it comes in again on that 2. So here on bar 21, we have a really interesting modulation. So we essentially go from the key of B flat to the key of F. And so this piano ostinato sort of shuts down. Then we just have those quarter notes, and then the quarter note changes to the new key. And then the strings make way and sort of transition into the key of F. And at the current point in the movie, Briony is running around the house, so these strings just really create a sense of sort of momentum and adventure. And then we go back to that original theme, and we're sort of back to the same texture that we had beforehand, but these strings, again, are just continuing under the surface and create a lot of this momentum. And you can see there's a constant handoff between the upper strings and the lower strings. So once one phrase is finished, it sort of hands it off to the violins, and then it goes back down to the basses and the cello. So the way in which this is functioning is sort of like imitation, which you would learn in like a Baroque counterpoint class. And so leading up to this point, our bass has essentially just been the tonic, or the 1. But now we're changing our bass to the 5, and then we have the strings really creating this sense of tension. So in bar 33, we modulate to the dominant, and we have these typewriters come back in just with a bit more sort of movement, a bit more uncontrollable. And then we have some horns and some string longs which come in to really accent the dominant. And that sounds all together like this. And so one thing to notice about the strings is just the amount of counterpoint in here. So you can see the sort of contrary motion happening, and this is, again, all stuff that you'd learn in like a Baroque classical composition class. So the way in which the different voices, being the violins, violas, cellos, and basses, are sort of moving together in a way is a very sort of sophisticated writing style. So you could tell that Marinelli really put a lot of work into this. And these string shorts are really our transitional point from key to key, and they're sort of the thing, again, that are keeping the momentum, which is accenting what's happening on the film itself. So now we're into a new key and also a new cue. This is Two Figures by a Fountain, which is the scene where Robbie and Cecilia are touche at the fountain. So we go back to the exact same theme, but the orchestration changes because we've introduced a harp. Then we have strings come back in doing these sort of 8th note phrases. Piano comes in, is really doing these like octave minor scales in context. And that's doubled by two different things. First of all, a full-on sort of doubling of what the piano is doing. And then we have sort of 8th note accents of what the piano is doing. And then a string-long sort of counterline, which is sort of working to create a sort of glue over this specific section, which is, of course, made up of a lot of different voices moving all over the place. On bar 50, the strings sort of take over in terms of what the piano was doing with the scales, and we have this big, huge accent with low strings, which really help to create a nice, deep growl. And so then here, Marinelli puts the melody in the English horn, which is a beautiful instrument. It's like a lower oboe, and it has a really nice, warm, sort of contemplating tone to it. And it works really well in context. And so throughout this whole entire section, you can see the strings are just continuing to move up and down. They're continuing to have the sense of imitation, handing off from one instrument group to another. So now for this next section, Marinelli is putting the main melody in the strings. It's being doubled by the clarinet. And the great thing about the clarinet is that it has this really, really nice quality that just sort of blends in with the upper strings. And he uses it all the time to really just create the sense of warmth within the string section. And then looking at this next part where it modulates to A, you can see that he brings in the flutes doubled with the English horn. And those are, of course, separated by an octave. And so throughout this whole section, he has the pizzicatos creating this constant movement under the texture, doubled by lower string shorts. And those get a bit more prominent on bar 63. So you can see through all these different modulations, he's also changing the sort of sonic makeup of the pieces and just introducing these small little elements, whether it's a, string eighth note phrase, whether it's this doubling between the English horn and the flutes. He's constantly just keeping things interesting, not only by modulating, but also by, creating new sonic textures. And the piano in this specific section is acting almost as like the hammer, because if you take out the piano, you can see that the woodwinds definitely still work on their own, but they don't have the accent or the impact. And then with the piano. And I don't know if I've mentioned this, but like Marinelli is probably my favorite composer in terms of writing for piano. Whether it's this score or whether it's like Darkest Hour, his piano solos are just wildly incredible. I mean, he knows how to really take advantage of the full sort of range and the full capabilities of the piano. If you haven't heard Darkest Hour, I definitely recommend checking it out. So now we go into the love theme of the film, which is called Robbie's Note. So I needed to figure out a way in terms of arrangement to get from the key of A during this last cue to this new key. And so I used C as the pedal tone and just sort of have this hanging note. And then we brought in the dominant, and then finally we're in the key of B flat. And so during this section, we sort of enter this very Mozartian clarinet concerto-esque environment. And the clarinet just has such a warm, woody quality that just works incredibly well with the string section. And so for this section, the harmony is we go from the dominant of F to B flat sus4, G, C minor, and then we create this sort of diminished sound, and then we have the fifth in the bass leading back to the dominant. And so in regards to the strings are mostly just these very sort of long drawn out harmonies. So let's just listen to the main ensemble strings on their own. And then, of course, applying the lower end, we have the pizzicato strings, which the great thing about pizzicato strings is that they really do have the ability to just ring out and to just create this floor of bass. So in these situations where you have just these big long string chords, it's really helpful to have something lying below, whether it's like a plucked element or something creating a sense of sonic movement. And in this case, we have the harp, which is just ultra subtle, but it's a nice little spice, which creates, again, a bit of that sonic movement. So for the strings, what I've done is I've just layered first chair strings, so like solo strings, which are just really up front, really close mic'd, and they were actually recorded in their seating positions at the Tullduk stage. And then, when those are combined with the ensemble strings, it really just adds a bit of an extra level of dimension. Without. It definitely is not bad without. I just like the focus that it brings in. And so doubling the main melody, we have some high strings, which have this very sort of wide. And then we have the concertinos, which are much more sort of prevalent and strong. And then going into this later section, we have sort of my favorite tool in terms of really subtle legato lines, which is Metropolis Arc 2. And then in context. You could see that the consorts are just creating a bit of movement, sort of like what the cello section would be doing. And so Marinelli is a composer that doesn't use click at all, so his music tends to really sway and have this really nice flow to it. So I've gone in and just created a more sort of specific tempo map, just to let the string chords breathe a bit, especially during Denouement. And so programming the tempo to be more specific than just 120 or 90 was a very, very important aspect in trying to capture what Marinelli was going for. So while Robbie's note is the theme really signifying the positive aspect and the romantic aspect of the relationship, Farewell is, really highlighting the more tragic aspect of the relationship. So Robbie's note is, and Farewell. So one's major, one's minor, one's about the good, one's about the bad. So let's listen to Farewell. And I love the way in which he brings in this specific So what he's doing is we've been in the key of C, C minor, and so he sort of makes that a major and then goes down and then back to F minor, and then we have this diminished and then we're back to our tonic. So his harmony is, again, very, very romantic based, and it just has this almost simple yet beautiful quality, and the way in which he writes his melodies really help to accent that. Another thing to look at is just the sort of voicings of the various chords. So one thing to note about his string writing is that all of the different voices are very independent of each other. So if we just listen to violin 1 here, and then violin 2, and then the viola comes in, half note, and then the cellos, and that wasn't necessarily easy to figure out without a score. But yeah, it really, again, just goes back to the more traditional way of string writing, which I think is beautifully done. So in terms of our melody, the English horn is carrying it for the first half of the piece. And then the clarinet grabs it for the second half, which is, again, doubling the string octaves. And then we have the bassoons in the lower section of the woodwinds, doubling the basses. And then we have this counter melody with the horns. And then the piano and the harp are, again, just creating this sonic movement. You could see it moving up those minor thirds, so we had... And so a thing that Marinelli does a really good job of here is waiting to use the basses until he really wants to pronounce a certain section. So this whole moment, you know, here, this is all just violins, violas, cellos. And when we get the basses, it really just enforces this moment. Then, of course, the string octaves. And so Marinelli notably uses this specific theme during the Dunkirk sequence, which I just think is one of the best scenes like in film history. The fact that it was all done with one tracking shot, and the way in which the, you know, choir is intertwined into the piece, and it just builds and builds and builds and has this emotional arc, which I think is extraordinary. So let's just go ahead and play the theme itself on some strings. So one thing that he uses here is something that we've talked about in the past, which is called the threading technique, which is where multiple voices will change, but one will linger on, and then, you know, it'll change. So that creates a sense of suspension and this emotional tension. And so this is really just like a second suspension, but the way it's inverted is you have the third in the bass. And I've always called this the Marinelli chord because he uses it quite a bit, and it's just breathtaking. Solo cello. Clarinet, which comes in as a counter melody here. And then just very, very, very subtle horns, which are working in the background to just add a sense of warmth to the string section. So he's using a lot of sort of very Elgarian harmony, which is, you know, using a lot of the thirds and the basses, using a lot of suspensions. And so to end this piece, he goes... And then we go up a half step. We get to that big B major chord, which to me just says hope. You know what I mean? It just has the word hope written on it. And then we go back into the strings. This time they're exclusively high strings, very sort of airy, and that's being doubled by a harmonica. I only had access to a harmonium. In terms of samples, I couldn't find a harmonica, so it had a very similar quality. Very accordion-ish sound, too. And this is another case of... you know, sonic narrative association. So like he was using the typewriter at the beginning, he's now using something that an actual person is playing on screen in the tunnels, and he incorporates that into the score. Brings in the basses. And so this is a really interesting modulation. So we land on, and he pivots, so he goes from this C, which is the third in the chord, and then now we're in A minor. So just a really, really smart modulation. And at this point, the clarinet is completely doubling the strings. Then we have this counter melody that comes in here. And we have a drastic tempo drop here. Build back up. And so for this section, the strings sort of enter this, again, this sort of octave feel, and then the brass comes into sort of full force, but still maintaining that low timbre, really warm quality versus the more aggressive side of brass. So this is one of the more emotional sequences of the film, and this is sort of the big, huge crescendo before we cut back to modern day. So he brings in this huge, huge low end. So we, of course, have that low rumbling bass, and then the hits, and then the really, really sort of soft, dynamic, yet wide cymbal rolls. And then we end with the final cue, Cottage on the Beach, which is this very subdued cue with pianos, doubled by a harp, some strings that just sort of weave over, and then we're finally out. So here is all of that together. So there is Behind the Score Atonement. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope that you guys enjoyed. I just want to look at a few main sort of highlights that Dario Marinelli uses throughout the score that I think are really, really important and that we can take into our own music. So the first thing is musical subtext. So Dario Marinelli is a master of diving into these very, very intricate levels of characters, whether it's Briony and her sort of mysterious urgency as a child, and things that we don't necessarily completely see on screen. He dives into the sort of underlying emotions of a lot of these characters and a lot of these relationships. And similar to what we were talking about during the James Newton Howard video, this is a great way of expanding the boundaries of the frame, and really diving into the layers that lie beneath the immediate narrative. Now the next thing is sonic narrative association. So we've seen many times where composers have sort of taken elements from the movie itself and sort of brought it into the soundtrack, but the way in which Dario Marinelli makes the typewriter essentially a part of the orchestra is just so masterful, and the way in which he introduces it up at the first frame before the music even starts. I just think that it really introduces you to the character of Briony and, of course, her occupation, and also introducing you to the fact that this movie, as we see it, is through the perspective of Briony. And we really come to see that during the final few minutes during Briony's monologue, but I think this is just a great way of making the score even more so intertwined with the world of the film. Now, one of the things that I love about Marinelli's style in film scoring is his approach to thematic material. Now, throughout the history of film, we've seen character themes, we've seen item themes, environmental themes. You commonly have like a protagonist and an antagonist theme. And so the thing about Marinelli, especially if you look at something like Anna Karenina, is that he creates these sort of aesthetic themes. So you have, like in this film, your tragedy theme, you have your childhood mystery theme, you have your sort of love theme between Robbie and Cecilia. And so he doesn't necessarily directly link to the surface level, but he relates to certain emotions and certain feelings that the audience members are feeling at certain points in the movie, which I think is a really good way of indirectly helping to assist in telling the story. Now the next thing is musical perspectives, or the sort of point of view of the music. So when we first see Jack Sparrow in the first Pirates film, he's on this tiny little ship which is about to sink, and he sees himself as this grand pirate rock star, and the music definitely complements the way in which he sees himself. And this specific film takes a lot of different musical perspectives, whether it's really Briony during the first half of the film. We're seeing the world through her eyes, which is in a very sort of mysterious way. And then we go into Cecilia's, and Robbie's sort of relationship, and we see it through that perspective. And then towards the later half of the film, we get into Cecilia and the point of view of her older self looking back at the tragedy throughout her life. So again, another great way in which Marinelli immerses himself in the narrative. But anyways, again, thank you guys so much for watching, and if you guys are interested in staying up to date with all that's happening on the channel, you guys can subscribe and hit the bell icon down below. There's going to be a whole lot more coming soon, including behind the scores, of course more of that video essay series that we got started last week, and much more. But thanks again, and I'll see you guys soon.